General Butterfield, the Major General commanding, directs that General Sedgwick cross the river, as soon as indications will permit, capture Fredericksburg with everything in it, and vigorously pursue the enemy. We know that the enemy is fleeing, trying to save his trains. 2 of Sickles' divisions are among them. At 4 o'clock, therefore, the moment Jackson's vanguard reached the old turnpike near Luckett's farm, Hooker believed that all danger of a flank attack had passed away. His left wing was under orders to advance, as soon as a swamp to the front could be corduroyed, and strike Lee in flank. While to reinforce Sickles, among the enemy's trains, Williams' division of the 12th Corps was sent forward from the centre, Howard's reserve brigade, Barlow's, from the right, and Pleasanton's cavalry brigade from Hazel Grove. The officers in charge of the Federal right appear to have been as unsuspicious as their commander. During the morning, some slight preparations were made to defend the turnpike from the westward. A shallow line of rifle pits, with a few epaulements for artillery, had been constructed on a low ridge, commanding open fields, which runs north from Dowdall's Tavern, and the wood beyond had been partially entangled. But this was all, and even when the only reserve of the 11th Army Corps, Barlow's brigade, was sent to Sickles, it was not considered necessary to make any change in the disposition of the troops. The belief that Lee and Jackson were retreating had taken firm hold of every mind. The pickets on the flank had indeed reported from time to time that infantry was massing in the thickets, and the Confederate cavalry, keeping just outside effective range, occupied every road and every clearing. Yet no attempt was made, by a strong reconnaissance in force, to ascertain what was actually going on within the forest, and the reports of the scouts were held to be exaggerated. The neglect was the more marked in that the position of the 11th Army Corps was very weak. Howard had with him 20 regiments of infantry and 6 batteries, but his force was completely isolated. His extreme right, consisting of 4 German regiments, was posted in the forest, with 2 guns facing westward on the pike, and a line of entrenchments facing south. On the low hill eastward, where Talley's farm, a small wooden cottage, stood in the midst of a wide clearing, were 2 more German regiments and 2 American. Then, near the junction of the roads, intervened a patch of forest, which was occupied by 4 regiments with a brigade upon their left, and beyond, nearly a mile wide from north to south, and 500 or 600 yards in breadth, were the open fields round the little wilderness church, dipping at first to a shallow brook, and then rising gradually to a house called Dowdall's Tavern. In these fields, south of the turnpike, were the breastworks held by the 2nd Division of the 11th Army Corps, and here were 6 regiments, with several batteries in close support. The 60th New York and 26th Wisconsin, near the Hawkins house at the north end of the fields, faced to the west. The remainder all faced south. Beyond Dowdall's Tavern rose the forest, dark and impenetrable to the view. But to the southeast, nearly 2 miles from Talley's, the clearings of Hazel Grove were plainly visible. This part of the line, originally entrusted to General Sickles, was now unguarded, for 2 divisions of the 3rd Corps were moving on the Furnace, and the nearest force which could render support to Howard's was Berry's division, retained in reserve northeast of Chancellorsville, 3 miles distant from Talley's farm and nearly 2 from Howard's left. The Confederates, meanwhile, were rapidly forming for attack. Notwithstanding their fatigue, for many of the brigades had marched over 15 miles, the men were in the highest spirits. A young staff officer who passed along the column relates that he was everywhere recognized with the usual greetings. "Say, here's one of old Jack's little boys. Let him by, boys. Have a good breakfast this morning, sonny? Better hurry up or you'll catch it for getting behind. Tell old Jack we're all a-comin'. Don't let him begin the fuss till we get there." But on reaching the turnpike, orders were given that all noise should cease, and the troops, deploying for a mile or more on either side of the road, took up their formation for attack. In front were the skirmishers of Rhodes' division, under Major Blackford. 400 yards in rear came the lines of battle, Rhodes forming the first line, Colston at 200 yards distance, the second line, A.P. Hill, part in line and part in column, the third. In little more than an hour and a half, notwithstanding the dense woods, the formation was completed, and the lines dressed at the proper angle to the road. 5:45 p.m. Notwithstanding that the enemy might at any moment awake to their danger, not a single precaution was neglected. Jackson was determined that the troops should move forward in good order, and that every officer and man should know what was expected from him. Staff officers had been stationed at various points to maintain communication between the divisions, and the divisional and brigade commanders had received their instructions. The whole force was to push resolutely forward through the forest. The open hill, about 1,000 yards eastward, on which stood Talley's farm, was to be carried at all hazard, for, so far as could be ascertained, it commanded, over an intervening patch of forest, the ridge which ran north from Dowdall's Tavern. After the capture of the heights at Talley's, if the Federals showed a determined front on their second line, Rhodes was to halt under cover until the artillery could come up and dislodge them. Under no other circumstances was there to be any pause in the advance. A brigade of the first line was detailed to guard the right flank, a regiment the left, and the second and third lines were ordered to support the first whenever it might be necessary, without waiting for further instructions. The field hospital was established at the Old Wilderness Tavern. The men were in position, eagerly awaiting the signal. Their quick intelligence had already realized the situation, and all was life and animation. Across the narrow clearing stretched the long grey lines, penetrating far into the forest on either flank. In the centre, on the road, were 4 Napoleon guns, the horses fretting with excitement. Far to the rear, their rifles glistening under the long shafts of the setting sun, the heavy columns of A.P. Hill's division were rapidly advancing, and the rumble of the artillery closing to the front grew louder and louder. Jackson, watch in hand, sat silent on Little Sorrel, his slouched hat drawn low over his eyes, and his lips tightly compressed. On his right was General Rhodes, tall, lithe, and soldierly, and on Rhodes' right was Major Blackford. "Are you ready, General Rhodes?" said Jackson. "Yes, sir," said Rhodes, impatient as his men. "You can go forward, sir," said Jackson. 6 p.m. A nod from Rhodes was a sufficient order to Blackford, and the woods rang with the notes of a single bugle. Back came the responses from bugles to right and left, and the skirmishers, dashing through the wild undergrowth, sprang eagerly to their work, followed by the quick rush of the lines of battle. For a moment the troops seemed buried in the thickets. Then, as the enemy's sentries, completely taken by surprise, fired a few scattered shots, and the guns on the turnpike came quickly into action. The echoes waked. Through the still air of the summer evening rang the rebel yell, filling the forest far to north and south, and the hearts of the astonished Federals, lying idly behind their breastworks, stood still within them. So rapid was the advance, so utterly unexpected the attack, that the pickets were at once overrun, and crashing through the timber, driving before it the wild creatures of the forest, deer and hares and foxes, the broad front of the mighty torrent bore down upon Howard's flank. For a few moments the 4 regiments which formed his right, supported by 2 guns, held staunchly together, and even checked for a brief space the advance of O'Neill's brigade. But from the right and from the left the grey infantry swarmed round them. The second line came surging forward to O'Neill's assistance. The gunners were shot down and their pieces captured, and in 10 minutes the right brigade of the Federal army, submerged by numbers, was flying in panic across the clearing. Here, near Talley's farm, on the fields south of the turnpike and in the forest to the north, another brigade, hastily changing front, essayed to stay the rout. But Jackson's horse artillery, moving forward at a gallop, poured in canister at short range, and 3 brigades, O'Neill's, Iverson's, and Dole's, attacked the Northerners fiercely in front and flank. No troops, however brave, could have long withstood that overwhelming rush. The slaughter was very great. Every mounted officer was shot down, and in 10 or 15 minutes the fragments of these hapless regiments were retreating rapidly and tumultuously towards the Wilderness Church. The first position had been captured, but there was no pause in the attack. As Jackson, following the artillery, rode past Talley's farm and gazed across the clearing to the east, he saw a sight which raised high his hopes of a decisive victory. Already in the green cornfields, the spoils of battle lay thick around him. Squads of prisoners were being hurried to the rear. Abandoned guns and wagons overturned, the wounded horses still struggling in the traces, were surrounded by the dead and dying of Howard's brigades. Knapsacks piled in regular order, arms, blankets, accoutrements, lay in profusion near the breastworks. And beyond, under a rolling cloud of smoke and dust, the bare fields, sloping down to the brook, were covered with fugitives. Still further eastward, along. The plank road, speeding in wild confusion towards Chancellorsville, was a dense mass of men and wagons. Cattle, maddened with fright, were rushing to and fro, and on the ridge beyond the little church, pushing their way through the terror-stricken throng like ships through a heavy sea, or breaking into fragments before the pressure, the irregular lines of a few small regiments were moving hastily to the front. At more than one point on the edge of the distant woods, guns were coming into action. The hill near Talley's farm was covered with projectiles. Men were falling, and the Confederate first line was already in some confusion. Galloping up the turnpike and urging the artillery forward with voice and gesture, Jackson passed through the ranks of his eager infantry, and then Rhodes's division, rushing down the wooded slopes, burst from the covert, and driving their flying foes before them, advanced against the trenches on the opposite ridge. Here and there the rush of the first line was checked by the bold resistance of the German regiments. On the right especially, progress was slow, for Colquitt's brigade, drawn off by the pressure of Federal outposts in the woods to the south, had lost touch with the remainder of the division. Ramseur's brigade in rear had been compelled to follow suit, and on this flank the Federals were most effectively supported by their artillery. But Iverson, O'Neill and Doles, hardly halting to reform as they left the woods and followed closely by the second line, swept rapidly across the fields, dashed back the regiments which sought to check them, and under a hot fire of grape and canister pressed resolutely forward. The rifle pits on the ridge were occupied by the last brigade of Howard's Army Corps. A battery was in rear, 3 more were on the left, near Dowdall's Tavern, and many of the fugitives from Talley's farm had rallied behind the breastwork. But a few guns and 4,000 or 5,000 rifles, although the ground to the front was clear and open, were powerless to arrest the rush of Jackson's veterans. The long lines of colours, tossing redly above the swiftly moving ranks, never for a moment faltered. The men, running alternately to the front, delivered their fire, stopped for a moment to load, and then again ran on. Nearer and nearer they came, until the defenders of the trenches, already half demoralised, could mark through the smoke drift the tanned faces, the fierce eyes, and the gleaming bayonets of their terrible foes. The guns were already flying, and the position was outflanked. Yet along the whole length of the ridge the parapets still blazed with fire, and while men fell headlong in the Confederate ranks, for a moment there was a check, but it was the check of a mighty wave, mounting slowly to full volume ere it falls in thunder on the shrinking sands. Running to the front with uplifted swords, the officers gave the signal for the charge. The men answered with a yell of triumph. The second line, closing rapidly on the first, could no longer be restrained, and as the grey masses, crowding together in their excitement, breasted the last slope, the Federal infantry in every quarter of the field gave way before them. The ridge was abandoned, and through the dark pines beyond rolled the rout of the 11th Army Corps. 7 p.m. It was 7 o'clock. Twilight was falling on the woods, and Rhodes and Colston's divisions had become so inextricably mingled that officers could not find their men nor men their officers. But Jackson, galloping into the disordered ranks, directed them to press the pursuit. His face was aglow with the blaze of battle. His swift gestures and curt orders, admitting of no question, betrayed the fierce intensity of his resolution. Although the great tract of forest, covering Chancellorsville on the west, had swallowed up the fugitives, he had no need of vision to reveal to him the extent of his success. 10,000 men had been utterly defeated. The enemy's right wing was scattered to the winds. The Southerners were within 1.5 miles of the Federals' centre and completely in rear of their entrenchments, and the White House, or Bullock Road, only 1/2 mile to the front, led directly to Hooker's line of retreat by the United States Ford. Until that road was in his possession, Jackson was determined to call no halt. The dense woods, the gathering darkness, the fatigue and disorder of his troops, he regarded no more than he did the enemy's overwhelming numbers. In spirit, he was standing at Hooker's side, and he saw, as clearly as though the intervening woods had been swept away, the condition to which his adversary had been reduced. To the Federal headquarters, confusion and dismay had come, indeed, with appalling suddenness. Late in the afternoon, Hooker was sitting with 2 aides-de-camp in the veranda of the Chancellor House. There were few troops in sight. The 3rd Corps and Pleasonton's cavalry had long since disappeared in the forest. The 12th Army Corps, with the exception of 2 brigades, was already advancing against Anderson, and only the trains and some artillery remained within the entrenchments at Hazel Grove. All was going well. A desultory firing broke out at intervals to the eastward, but it was not sustained, and 3 miles to the south, where, as Hooker believed, in pursuit of Jackson, Sickles, and Pleasonton were, the reports of their cannon, growing fainter and fainter as they pushed further south, betokened no more than a lively skirmish. The quiet of the wilderness, save for those distant sounds, was undisturbed, and men and animals, free from every care, were enjoying the calm of the summer evening. It was about 6:30. Suddenly the cannonade swelled to a heavier roar, and the sound came from a new direction. All were listening intently, speculating on what this might mean, when a staff officer, who had stepped out to the front of the house and was looking down the plank road with his glass, exclaimed, "My God, here they come!" Hooker sprang upon his horse, and riding rapidly down the road, met the stragglers of the 11th Corps, men, wagons, and ambulances, an ever-increasing crowd, rushing in blind terror from the forest, flying they knew not whither. The whole of the right wing, they said, overwhelmed by superior numbers, was falling back on Chancellorsville, and Stonewall Jackson was in hot pursuit. The situation had changed in the twinkling of an eye. Just now congratulating himself on the complete success of his manoeuvres, on the retreat of his enemies, on the flight of Jackson and the helplessness of Lee, Hooker saw his strong entrenchments taken in reverse, his army scattered, his reserves far distant, and the most dreaded of his opponents, followed by his victorious veterans, within a few hundred yards of his headquarters. His weak point had been found, and there were no troops at hand wherewith to restore the fight. The centre was held only by the 2 brigades of the 12th Corps at the Fairview Cemetery. The works at Hazel Grove were untenanted, save by a few batteries and a handful of infantry. The 2nd and 5th Corps on the left were fully occupied by McLaws, for Lee, at the first sound of Jackson's guns, had ordered a vigorous attack up the pike and the plank road. Sickles, with 20,000 men, was far away, isolated and perhaps surrounded, and the line of retreat, the road to United States Ford, was absolutely unprotected. Messengers were dispatched in hot haste to recall Sickles and Pleasonton to Hazel Grove. Berry's division, forming the reserve northeast of the Chancellor House, was summoned to Fairview, and Hayes's brigade of the 2nd Corps ordered to support it. But what could 3 small brigades, hurried into position and unprotected by entrenchments, avail against 25,000 Southerners, led by Stonewall Jackson and animated by their easy victory? If Berry and Hayes could stand fast against the rush of fugitives, it was all that could be expected, and as the uproar in the dark woods swelled to a deeper volume, and the yells of the Confederates mingled with the crash of the musketry were borne to his ears, Hooker must have felt that all was lost. To make matters worse, as Pleasonton, hurrying back with his cavalry, arrived at Hazel Grove, the trains of the 3rd Army Corps, fired on by the Confederate skirmishers, dashed wildly across the clearing, swept through the parked artillery, and breaking through the forest, increased the fearful tumult which reigned round Chancellorsville. The gunners, however, with a courage beyond all praise, stood staunchly to their pieces, and soon a long line of artillery, for which 2 regiments of the 3rd Army Corps, coming up rapidly from the south, formed a sufficient escort, was established on this commanding hill. Other batteries, hitherto held in reserve, took post on the high ground at Fairview, a mile to the northeast, and, although Berry's infantry were not yet in position, and the stream of broken troops was still pouring past, a strong front of 50 guns opposed the Confederate advance. But it was not the artillery that saved Hooker from irretrievable disaster. As they followed the remnants of the 11th Army Corps, the progress of Rhodes and Colston had been far less rapid than when they stormed forward past the Wilderness Church. A regiment of Federal cavalry, riding to Howard's aid by a track from Hazel Grove to the Plank Road, was quickly swept aside, but the deep darkness of the forest, the efforts of the officers to reform the ranks, the barriers opposed by the tangled undergrowth, the difficulty of keeping the direction, brought a large portion of the troops to a standstill. At the junction of the White House Road, the order to halt was given, and although a number of men, pushing impetuously forward, seized a line of log breastworks which ran northwest through the timber below the Fairview Heights, the pursuit was stayed in the midst of the dense thickets. 8:15 p.m. At this moment, shortly after 8 o'clock, Jackson was at Dowdall's Tavern. The reports from the front informed him that his 1st and 2nd lines had halted. General Rhodes, who had galloped up the Plank Road to reconnoitre, sent in word that there were no Federal troops to be seen between his line and the Fairview Heights. And Colonel Cobb, of the 44th Virginia, brought the news that the strong entrenchments, less than a mile from Chancellorsville, had been occupied without resistance. There was a lull in the battle. The firing had died away, and the excited troops, with a clamour that was heard in the Federal lines, sought their companies and regiments by the dim light of the rising moon. But deeming that nothing was done while aught remained to do, Jackson was already planning a further movement. Sending instructions to A.P. Hill to relieve Rhodes and Colston and to prepare for a night attack, he rode forward, almost unattended, amongst his rallying troops, and lent his aid to the efforts of the regimental officers. Intent on bringing up the 2 divisions in close support of Hill, he passed from one regiment to another. Turning to Colonel Cobb, he said to him, "Find General Rhodes and tell him to occupy the barricades at once," and then added, "I need your help for a time. This disorder must be corrected. As you go along the right, tell the troops from me to get into line and preserve their order." It was long, however, before the men could be assembled, and the delay was increased by an unfortunate incident. Jackson's chief of artillery, pressing forward up the Plank Road to within 1,000 yards of Chancellorsville, opened fire with 3 guns upon the enemy's position. This audacious proceeding evoked a quick reply. Such Federal guns as could be brought to bear were at once turned upon the road, and although the damage done was small, A.P. Hill's brigades, just coming up into line, were for the moment checked. Under the hail of shell and canister, the artillery horses became unmanageable, the drivers lost their nerve, and as they rushed to the rear, some of the infantry joined them, and a stampede was only prevented by the personal efforts of Jackson, Colston, and their staff officers. Colonel Crutchfield was then ordered to cease firing. The Federals did the same, and A.P. Hill's brigades, that of General Lane leading, advanced to the deserted breastworks, while 2 brigades, one from Rhodes' division and one from Colston's, were ordered to guard the roads from Hazel Grove. 8:45 p.m. These arrangements made, Jackson proceeded to join his advanced line. At the point where the track to the White House and United States Ford strikes the Plank Road, he met General Lane, seeking his instructions for the attack. They were sufficiently brief. "Push right ahead, Lane, right ahead." As Lane galloped off to his command, General Hill and some of his staff came up, and Jackson gave Hill his orders. "Press them. Cut them off from the United States Ford Hill. Press them." General Hill replied that he was entirely unacquainted with the topography of the country, and asked for an officer to act as guide. Jackson directed Captain Boswell, his chief engineer, to accompany General Hill, and then, turning to the front, rode up the Plank Road, passing quickly through the ranks of the 18th North Carolina of Lane's brigade. 200 or 300 yards eastward the general halted, for the ringing of axes and the words of command were distinctly audible in the enemy's lines. While the Confederates were reforming, Hooker's reserves had reached the front, and Berry's regiments, on the Fairview Heights, using their bayonets and tin plates for entrenching tools, piling up the earth with their hands, and hacking down the brushwood with their knives, were endeavouring in desperate haste to provide some shelter, however slight, against the rush that they knew was about to come. After a few minutes, becoming impatient for the advance of Hill's division, Jackson turned and retraced his steps towards his own lines. "General," said an officer who was with him, "you should not expose yourself so much." "There is no danger, sir. The enemy is routed. Go back and tell General Hill to press on." Once more, when he was only 60 or 80 yards from where the 18th North Carolina were standing in the trees, he drew rein and listened. The whole party, generals, staff officers, and couriers, hidden in the deep shadows of the silent woods. At this moment a single rifle shot rang out with startling suddenness. A detachment of Federal infantry, groping their way through the thickets, had approached the southern lines. The skirmishers on both sides were now engaged, and the lines of battle in rear became keenly on the alert. Some mounted officers galloped hastily back to their commands. The sound startled the Confederate soldiers, and an officer of the 18th North Carolina, seeing a group of strange horsemen riding towards him through the darkness, for Jackson, hearing the firing, had turned back to his own lines, gave the order to fire. The volley was fearfully effective. Men and horses fell dead and dying on the narrow track. Jackson himself received 3 bullets, 1 in the right hand and 2 in the left arm, cutting the main artery and crushing the bone below the shoulder, and as the reins dropped upon his neck, little Sorrel, frantic with terror, plunged into the wood and rushed towards the Federal lines. An overhanging bough struck his rider violently in the face, tore off his cap and nearly unhorsed him, but recovering his seat, he managed to seize the bridle with his bleeding hand and turned into the road. Here Captain Wilbourn, one of his staff officers, succeeded in catching the reins, and as the horse stopped, Jackson leaned forward and fell into his arms. Captain Hotchkiss, who had just returned from a reconnaissance, rode off to find Dr. Maguire, while Captain Wilbourn, with a small penknife, ripped up the sleeve of the wounded arm. As he was doing so, General Hill, who had himself been exposed to the fire of the North Carolinians, reached the scene, and throwing himself from his horse, pulled off Jackson's gauntlets, which were full of blood, and bandaged the shattered arm with a handkerchief. "General," he said, "are you much hurt?" "I think I am," was the reply, "and all my wounds are from my own men. I believe my right arm is broken." To all questions put to him he answered in a perfectly calm and self-possessed tone, and although he spoke no word of complaint, he was manifestly growing weaker. It seemed impossible to move him, and yet it was absolutely necessary that he should be carried to the rear. He was still in front of his own lines, and even as Hill was speaking, 2 of the enemy's skirmishers, emerging from the thicket, halted within a few paces of the little group. Hill, turning quietly to his escort, said, "Take charge of those men," and 2 orderlies, springing forward, seized the rifles of the astonished Federals. Lieutenant Morrison, Jackson's aide-de-camp, who had gone down the road to reconnoitre, now reported that he had seen a section of artillery unlimbering close at hand. Hill gave orders that the general should be at once removed, and that no one should tell the men that he was wounded. Jackson, lying on Hill's breast, opened his eyes and said, "Tell them simply that you have a wounded Confederate officer." Lieutenant Smith and Morrison, and Captain Lee of Hill's staff, now lifted him to his feet, and with their aid he walked a few steps through the trees. But hardly had they gained the road when the Federal batteries, along their whole front, opened a terrible fire of grape and canister. The storm of bullets tearing through the foliage was fortunately directed too high, and the 3 young officers, laying the general down by the roadside, endeavoured to shield him by lying between him and the deadly hail. The earth round them was torn up by the shot, covering them with dust. Boughs fell from the trees, and fire flashed from the flints and gravel of the roadway. Once Jackson attempted to rise, but Smith threw his arm over him, holding him down and saying, "General, you must be still. It will cost you your life to rise." After a few minutes, however, the enemy's gunners, changing from canister to shell, mercifully increased their range, and again, as the Confederate infantry came hurrying to the front, their wounded leader, supported by strong arms, was lifted to his feet. Anxious that the men should not recognize him, Jackson turned aside into the wood and slowly and painfully dragged himself through the undergrowth. As he passed along, General Fender, whose brigade was then pushing forward, asked Smith who it was that was wounded. "A Confederate officer," was the reply, but as they came nearer, Fender, despite the darkness, saw that it was Jackson. Springing from his horse, he hurriedly expressed his regret, and added that his lines were so much disorganized by the enemy's artillery that he feared it would be necessary to fall back. At this moment, says an eyewitness, the scene was a fearful one. The air seemed to be alive with the shriek of shells and the whistling of bullets. Horses, riderless and mad with fright, dashed in every direction. Hundreds left the ranks and hurried to the rear, and the groans of the wounded and dying mingled with the wild shouts of others to be led again to the assault. Almost fainting as he was from loss of blood, desperately wounded, and in the midst of this awful uproar, Jackson's heart was unshaken. The words of Fender seemed to rouse him to life. Pushing aside those who supported him, he raised himself to his full height and answered feebly but distinctly enough to be heard above the din, "You must hold your ground, General Fender. You must hold out to the last, sir." His strength was now completely gone, and he asked to be allowed to lie down. His staff officers, however, refused assent. The shells were still crashing through the forest, and a litter having been brought up by Captain Lee, he was carried slowly towards Dowdall's tavern. But before they were free of the tangled wood, one of the stretcher-bearers, struck by a shot in the arm, let go the handle. Jackson fell violently to the ground on his wounded side. His agony must have been intense, and for the first time he was heard to groan. Smith sprang to his side, and as he raised his head a bright beam of moonlight made its way through the thick foliage and rested upon his white and lacerated face. The aide-de-camp was startled by its great pallor and stillness, and cried out, "General, are you seriously hurt?" "No, Mr. Smith, don't trouble yourself about me," he replied quietly, and added some words about winning the battle first and attending to the wounded afterwards. He was again placed upon the litter and carried a few 100 yards, still followed by the Federal shells, to where his medical director was waiting with an ambulance. Dr. Maguire knelt down beside him and said, "I hope you are not badly hurt, General?" He replied very calmly but feebly, "I am badly injured, Doctor. I fear I am dying." After a pause he went on, "I am glad you have come. I think the wound in my shoulder is still bleeding." The bandages were readjusted, and he was lifted into the ambulance, where Colonel Crutchfield, who had also been seriously wounded, was already lying. Whiskey and morphia were administered, and by the light of pine torches, carried by a few soldiers, he was slowly driven through the fields where Hooker's right had so lately fled before his impetuous onset. All was done that could ease his sufferings, but some jolting of the ambulance over the rough road was unavoidable. And yet, writes Dr. Maguire, his uniform politeness did not forsake him even in these most trying circumstances. His complete control, too, over his mind, enfeebled as it was by loss of blood and pain, was wonderful. His suffering was intense, his hands were cold, his skin clammy. But not a groan escaped him, not a sign of suffering, except the light corrugation of the brow, the fixed, rigid face, the thin lips, so tightly compressed that the impression of the teeth could be seen through them. Except these, he controlled by his iron will all evidence of emotion, and, more difficult than this even, he controlled that disposition to restlessness which many of us have observed upon the battlefield as attending great loss of blood. Nor was he forgetful of others. He expressed very feelingly his sympathy for Crutchfield, and once, when the latter groaned aloud, he directed the ambulance to stop and requested me to see if something could not be done for his relief. After reaching the hospital, he was carried to a tent and placed in bed covered with blankets, and another drink of whisky and water given him. 2 hours and a half elapsed before sufficient reaction took place to warrant an examination, and at 2 o'clock on Sunday morning I informed him that chloroform would be given him. I told him also that amputation would probably be required, and asked, if it was found necessary, whether it should be done at once. He replied promptly, "Yes, certainly, Dr. Maguire, do for me whatever you think best." Chloroform was then administered, and the left arm amputated about 2 inches below the shoulder. Throughout the whole of the operation, and until all the dressings were applied, he continued insensible. About 3:30, Colonel, then Major, Pendleton arrived at the hospital. He stated that General Hill had been wounded and that the troops were in great disorder. General Stewart was in command and had sent him to see the general. At first I declined to permit an interview, but Pendleton urged that the safety of the army and success of the cause depended upon his seeing him. When he entered the tent, the general said, "Well, Major, I am glad to see you. I thought you were killed." Pendleton briefly explained the position of affairs, gave Stewart's message, and asked what should be done. Jackson was at once interested, and asked in his quick way several questions. When they were answered, he remained silent, evidently trying to think. He contracted his brow, set his mouth, and for some moments lay obviously endeavouring to concentrate his thoughts. For a moment we believed he had succeeded, for his nostrils dilated, and his eye flashed with its old fire, but it was only for a moment. His face relaxed again, and presently he answered, very feebly and sadly, "I don't know. I can't tell. Say to General Stewart he must do what he thinks best." Soon after this he slept. So, leaving behind him, struggling vainly against the oppression of his mortal hurt, the one man who could have completed the Confederate victory, Pendleton rode wearily through the night. Jackson's fall, at so critical a moment, just as the final blow was to be delivered, had proved a terrible disaster. Hill, who alone knew his intention of moving to the White House, had been wounded by a fragment of shell as he rode back to lead his troops. Boswell, who had been ordered to point out the road, had been killed by the same volley which struck down his chief and the subordinate generals, without instructions and without guides, with their men in disorder, and the enemy's artillery playing fiercely on the forest, had hesitated to advance. Hill, remaining in a litter near the line of battle, had sent for Stewart. The cavalry commander, however, was at some distance from the field. Late in the evening, finding it impossible to employ his command at the front, he had been detached by Jackson, a regiment of infantry supporting him, to take and hold Ely's Ford. He had already arrived within view of a Federal camp established at that point, and was preparing to charge the enemy under cover of the night when Hill's messenger recalled him. When Stewart reached the front, he found the troops still halted, Rhodes and Colston reforming on the open fields near Dowdall's Tavern, the light division deployed within the forest, and the generals anxious for their own security. So far the attack had been completely successful, but Lee's lack of strength prevented the full accomplishment of his design. Had Longstreet been present, with Pickett and Hood to lead his splendid infantry, the 3rd Corps and the 12th would have been so hardly pressed that Chancellorsville, Hazel Grove, and the White House would have fallen an easy prize to Jackson's bayonets. Anderson, with 4 small brigades, was powerless to hold the force confronting him, and marching rapidly northwards, Sickles had reached Hazel Grove before Jackson fell. Here Pleasanton, with his batteries, was still in position, and Hooker had not yet lost his head. As soon as Birney's and Whipple's divisions had come up, forming in columns of brigades behind the guns, Sickles was ordered to assail the enemy's right flank and check his advance. Just before midnight the attack was made, in 2 lines of battle, supported by strong columns. The night was very clear and still. The moon, nearly full, threw enough light into the woods to facilitate the advance, and the tracks leading northwest served as lines of direction. The attack, however, although gallantly made, gained no material advantage. The preliminary movements were plainly audible to the Confederates, and Lane's brigade, most of which was now south of the Plank Road, had made every preparation to receive it. Against troops lying down in the woods, the Federal artillery, although 50 or 60 guns were in action, made but small impression, and the dangers of a night attack made upon troops who are expecting it and whose moral is unaffected were forcibly illustrated. The confusion in the forest was very great. A portion of the assailing force, losing direction, fell foul of Berry's division at the foot of the Fairview Heights, which had not been informed of the movement, and at least 2 regiments, fired into from front and rear, broke up in panic. Some part of the log breastworks which Jackson's advanced line had occupied were recaptured, but not a single one of the assailants, except as prisoners, reached the Plank Road. And yet the attack was an exceedingly well-timed stroke, and as such, although the losses were heavy, had a very considerable effect on the issue of the day's fighting. It showed, or seemed to show, that the Federals were still in good heart, that they were rapidly concentrating, and that the Confederates might be met by vigorous counterstrokes. "The fact," said Stuart in his official dispatch, "that the attack was made, and at night made me apprehensive of a repetition of it." So, while Jackson slept through the hours of darkness that should have seen the consummation of his enterprise, his soldiers lay beside their arms, and the Federals, digging, felling, and building, constructed a new line of parapet, protected by a battis and strengthened by a long array of guns, on the slopes of Fairview and Hazel Grove. The respite which the fall of the Confederate leader had brought them was not neglected. The fast-spreading panic was stayed. The First Army Corps, rapidly crossing the Rappahannock, secured the road to the White House, and Averill's division of cavalry reached Ely's Ford. May 3rd. On the left, between Chancellorsville and the river, where a young Federal colonel named Miles handled his troops with conspicuous skill, Lee's continuous attacks had been successfully repulsed, and at dawn on the morning of May 3rd, the situation of the Union Army was far from unpromising. A gap of nearly 2 miles intervened between the Confederate wings, and within this gap, on the commanding heights of Hazel Grove and Fairview, the Federals were strongly entrenched. An opportunity for dealing a crushing counterblow, for holding one portion of Lee's army in check while the other was overwhelmed, appeared to present itself. The only question was whether the moral of the general and the men could be depended upon. In Stuart, however, Hooker had to deal with a soldier who was no unworthy successor of Stonewall Jackson. Reluctantly abandoning the idea of a night attack, the cavalry general, fully alive to the exigencies of the situation, had determined to reduce the interval between himself and Lee, and during the night the artillery was brought up to the front and the batteries deployed wherever they could find room. Just before the darkness began to lift, orders were received from Lee that the assault was to be made as early as possible, and the right wing, swinging round in order to come abreast of the centre, became hotly engaged. Away to the southeast, across the hills held by the Federals, came the responding thunder of Lee's guns, and 40,000 infantry, advancing through the woods against front and flank, enveloped in a circle of fire a stronghold which was held by over 60,000 muskets. It is unnecessary to describe minutely the events of the morning. The Federal troops, such as were brought into action, fought well, but Jackson's tremendous attack had already defeated Hooker. Before Sickles made his night attack from Hazel Grove, he had sent orders for Sedgwick to move at once, occupy Fredericksburg, seize the heights, and march westward by the Plank Road, and, at the same time, he had instructed his engineers to select and fortify a position about a mile in rear of Chancellorsville. So, when Stuart pressed forward, not only had this new position been occupied by the 1st and 5th Army Corps, but the troops hitherto in possession of Hazel Grove were already evacuating their entrenchments. These dispositions sufficiently attest the demoralization of the Federal commander. As the historian of the Army of the Potomac puts it, The movement to be executed by Sedgwick was precisely one of those movements which, according as they are wrought out, may be either the height of wisdom or the height of folly. Its successful accomplishment certainly promised very brilliant results. It is easy to see how seriously Lee's safety would be compromised if, while engaged with Hooker in front, he should suddenly find a powerful force assailing his rear and grasping already his direct line of communication with Richmond. But if, on the other hand, Lee should be able by any slackness on the part of his opponent to engage him in front with a part of his force, while he should turn swiftly round to assail the isolated moving column, it is obvious that he would be able to repulse or destroy that column, and then by a vigorous return meet or attack his antagonist's main body. In the successful execution of this plan, not only was Sedgwick bound to the most energetic action, but Hooker also was engaged by every consideration of honour and duty to so act as to make the dangerous task he had assigned to Sedgwick possible. But so far from aiding his subordinate by a heavy counter-attack on Lee's front, Hooker deliberately abandoned the Hazel Grove salient, which, keeping asunder the Confederate wings, strongly facilitated such a manoeuvre, and more than this, he divided his own army into two portions, of which the rear, occupying the new position, was actually forbidden to reinforce the front. It is possible that Hooker contemplated an early retreat of his whole force to the second position. If so, Lee and Stuart were too quick for him. The cavalry commander, as soon as it became light and the hills and undulations of the wilderness emerged from the shadows, immediately recognized the importance of Hazel Grove. The hill was quickly seized. 30 pieces of artillery, established on the crest, enfiladed the Federal batteries, facing west on the heights of Fairview, and the brigade on Stuart's extreme right was soon in touch with the troops directed by General Lee. Then against the three sides of the Federal position the battle raged. From the south and southeast came Anderson and McLaws, the batteries unlimbering on every eminence, and the infantry, hitherto held back, attacking with the vigour which their gallant commanders knew so well how to inspire. And from the west, formed in three lines, Hill's division to the front, came the Second Army Corps. The men knew by this time that the leader whom they trusted beyond all others had been struck down, that he was lying wounded, helpless, far away in rear. Yet his spirit was still with them. Stuart, galloping along the ranks, recalled him with ringing words to their memories, and as the bugles sounded the onset, it was with a cry of, "Remember Jackson!" that his soldiers rushed fiercely upon the Federal breastworks. The advanced line within the forest was taken at the first rush, the second at the foot of the Fairview Heights, protected by a swampy stream, a broad belt of abatis, and with 30 guns on the hill behind, proved far more formidable, and Hill's division was forced back. But Rhodes and Colston were in close support. The fight was speedily renewed, and then came charge and countercharge, the storm of the parapets, the rally of the defenders, the rush with the bayonet, and, mowing down men like grass, the fearful sweep of case and canister. Twice the Confederates were repulsed. Twice they reformed, brigade mingled with brigade, regiment with regiment, and charged again in the teeth of the 30 guns. On both sides ammunition began to fail. The brushwood took fire, the ground became hot beneath the foot, and many wounded perished miserably in the flames. Yet still, with the tangled abatis dividing the opposing lines, the fight went on. Both sides struggling fiercely, the Federals with the advantage of position, the Confederates of numbers, for Hooker refused to reinforce his gallant troops. At length the guns which Stuart had established on Hazel Grove, crossing their fire with those of McLaws and Anderson, gained the upper hand over the Union batteries. The storm of shell, sweeping the Fairview Plateau, took the breastworks in reverse. The Northern infantry, after 5 hours of such hot battle as few fields have witnessed, began sullenly to yield, and as Stuart, leading the last charge, leapt his horse over the parapet, the works were evacuated, and the tattered colours of the Confederates waved in triumph on the hill. "The scene," says a staff officer, "can never be effaced from the minds of those that witnessed it. The troops were pressing forward with all the ardour and enthusiasm of combat. The white smoke of musketry fringed the front of battle, while the artillery on the hills in rear shook the earth with its thunder and filled the air with the wild shrieking of the shells that plunged into the masses of the retreating foe. To add greater horror and sublimity to the scene, the Chancellorsville house and the woods surrounding it were wrapped in flames. It was then that General Lee rode to the front of his advancing battalions. His presence was the signal for one of those uncontrollable outbursts of enthusiasm which none can appreciate who have not witnessed them. The fierce soldiers, with their faces blackened with the smoke of battle, the wounded crawling with feeble limbs from the fury of the devouring flames, all seemed possessed of a common impulse. One long unbroken cheer, in which the feeble cry of those who lay helpless on the earth blended with the strong voices of those who still fought, hailed the presence of the victorious chief. His first care was for the wounded of both armies, and he was among the foremost at the burning mansion, where some of them lay. But at that moment, when the transports of his troops were drowning the roar of battle with acclamations, a note was brought to him from General Jackson. It was handed to him as he sat on his horse near the Chancellorsville house, and unable to open it with his gauntleted hands, he passed it to me with directions to read it to him. I shall never forget the look of pain and anguish that passed over his face as he listened. In a voice broken with emotion, he bade me say to General Jackson that the victory was his. I do not know how others may regard this incident, but for myself, as I gave expression to the thoughts of his exalted mind, I forgot the genius that won the day in my reverence for the generosity that refused its glory. Lee's reply ran, "General, I have just received your note informing me that you were wounded. I cannot express my regret at the occurrence. Could I have directed events, I should have chosen for the good of the country to be disabled in your stead. I congratulate you upon the victory, which is due to your skill and energy. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, R. E. Lee, General." Such was the tribute, not the less valued that it was couched in no exaggerated terms, which was brought to the bedside in the quiet hospital. Jackson was almost alone. As the sound of cannon and musketry borne across the forest grew gradually louder, he had ordered all those who had remained with him, except Mr. Smith, to return to the battlefield and attend to their different duties. His side, injured by his fall from the litter, gave him much pain, but his thoughts were still clear and his speech coherent. "General Lee," he said, when his aide-de-camp read to him the Commander-in-Chief's brief words, "is very kind, but he should give the praise to God." During the day, the pain gradually ceased. The general grew brighter, and from those who visited the hospital, he inquired minutely about the battle and the troops engaged. When conspicuous instances of courage were related, his face lit up with enthusiasm, and he uttered his usual good, with unwonted energy when the gallant behaviour of his old command was alluded to. "Some day," he said, "the men of that brigade will be proud to say to their children, 'I was one of the Stonewall Brigade.'" He disclaimed all right of his own to the name Stonewall. "It belongs to the brigade, and not to me." That night he slept well, and was free from pain. Meanwhile, the Confederate army, resting on the heights of Chancellorsville, preparatory to an attack upon Hooker's second stronghold, had received untoward news. Sedgwick, at 11 o'clock in the morning, had carried Mary's Hill, and driving early before him, was moving up the plank road. Wilcox's brigade of Anderson's division, then at Banks Ford, was ordered to retard the advance of the hostile column. McLaws was detached to Salem Church. The Second Army Corps and the rest of Anderson's division remained to hold Hooker in check, and for the moment operations at Chancellorsville were suspended. McLaws, deploying his troops in the forest, 250 yards from a wide expanse of cleared ground, pushed his skirmishers forward to the edge and awaited the attack of a superior force. Reserving his fire to close quarters, its effect was fearful. But the Federals pushed forward. A schoolhouse occupied as an advanced post was captured, and at this point Sedgwick was within an ace of breaking through. His second line, however, had not yet deployed, and a vigorous counterstroke, delivered by 2 brigades, drove back the whole of his leading division in great disorder. As night fell, the Confederates, careful not to expose themselves to the Union reserves, retired to the forest, and Sedgwick, like Hooker, abandoned all further idea of offensive action. May 4th. The next morning Lee himself, with the 3 remaining brigades of Anderson, arrived upon the scene. Sedgwick, who had lost 5,000 men the preceding day, had fortified a position covering Banks' Ford and occupied it with over 20,000 muskets. Lee, with the divisions of McLaws, Anderson, and Early, was slightly stronger. The attack was delayed, for the Federals held strong ground, difficult to reconnoitre. But once begun, the issue was soon decided. Assailed in front and flanks, with no help coming from Hooker, and only a single bridge at Banks' Ford in rear, the Federals rapidly gave ground. Darkness, however, intensified by a thick fog, made pursuit difficult, and Sedgwick recrossed the river with many casualties, but in good order. During these operations, that is, from 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon until after midnight on Monday, Hooker had not moved a single man to his subordinate's assistance. So extraordinary a situation has seldom been seen in war. An army of 60,000 men, strongly fortified, was held in check for 36 hours by 20,000, while not 7 miles away raged a battle on which the whole fate of the campaign depended. Lee and Jackson had made no false estimate of Hooker's incapacity. Sedgwick's Army Corps had suffered so severely in men and in moral that it was not available for immediate service, even had it been transferred to Chancellorsville, and Lee was now free to concentrate his whole force against the main body of the Federal Army. His men, notwithstanding their extraordinary exertions, were confident of victory. As I sheltered myself in a little farmhouse on the plank road, the brigades of Anderson's division came splashing through the mud, in wild, tumultuous spirits, singing, shouting, jesting, heedless of soaking rags, drenched to the skin, and burning again to mingle in the mad revelry of battle. But it was impossible to push forward, for a violent rainstorm burst upon the wilderness, and the spongy soil, saturated with the deluge, absolutely precluded all movement across country. Hooker, who had already made preparations for retreat, took advantage of the weather, and as soon as darkness set in, put his army in motion for the bridges. May 6th. By 8 o'clock on the morning of the 6th, the whole force had crossed, and when the Confederate patrols pushed forward, Lee found that his victim had escaped. The Army of the Potomac returned to its old camp on the hills above Fredericksburg, and Lee reoccupied his position on the opposite ridge. Stoneman, who had scoured the whole country to within a few miles of Richmond, returned to Kelly's Ford on May 8th. The raid had effected nothing. The damage done to the railroads and canals was repaired by the time the raiders had regained the Rappahannock. Lee's operations at Chancellorsville had not been affected in the very slightest degree by their presence in his rear, while Stoneman's absence had proved the ruin of the Federal Army. Jackson, who had been removed by the Commander-in-Chief's order to Mr. Chandler's house near Gurney's Station on the morning of May 5th, was asked what he thought of Hooker's plan of campaign. His reply was, "It was in the main a good conception, an excellent plan, but he should not have sent away his cavalry. That was his great blunder. It was that which enabled me to turn him without his being aware of it, and to take him in the rear. Had he kept his cavalry with him, his plan would have been a very good one." This was not his only comment on the great battle. Among other things, he said that he intended to cut the Federals off from the United States Ford, and, taking a position between them and the river, oblige them to attack him, adding, with a smile, "My men sometimes fail to drive the enemy from a position, but they always fail to drive us away." He spoke of General Rhodes, and alluded in high terms to his splendid behaviour in the attack on Howard. He hoped he would be promoted, and he said that promotion should be made at once, upon the field, so as to act as an incentive to gallantry in others. He spoke of Colonel Willis, who had commanded the skirmishers, and praised him very highly, and referred most feelingly to the death of Paxton, the commander of the Stonewall Brigade, and of Captain Boswell, his chief engineer. In speaking of his own share in the victory, he said, "Our movement was a great success. I think the most successful military movement of my life. But I expect to receive far more credit for it than I deserve. Most men will think I planned it all from the first, but it was not so. I simply took advantage of circumstances as they were presented to me in the providence of God. I feel that his hand led me. Let us give him the glory." It must always be an interesting matter of speculation what the result would have been had Jackson accomplished his design, on the night he fell, of moving a large part of his command up the White House Road and barring the only line of retreat left open to the Federals. Hooker, it is argued, had 2 corps in position which had been hardly engaged, the 2nd and the 5th, and another, the 1st, under Reynolds, was coming up. Of these, 25,000 men might possibly, could they have been manoeuvred in the forest, have been sent to drive Jackson back. And undoubtedly, to those who think more of numbers than of human nature, of the momentum of the mass rather than the mental equilibrium of the general, the fact that a superior force of comparatively fresh troops was at Hooker's disposal will be sufficient to put the success of the Confederates out of court. Yet the question will always suggest itself. Would not the report that a victorious enemy of unknown strength was pressing forward in the darkness of the night towards the only line of retreat have so demoralized the Federal commander and the Federal soldiers, already shaken by the overthrow of the 11th Army Corps, that they would have thought only of securing their own safety? Would Hooker, whose tactics the next day, after he had had the night given him in which to recover his senses, were so inadequate, have done better if he had received no respite? Would the soldiers of the 3 Army Corps not yet engaged, who had been witnesses of the rout of Howard's divisions, have fared better when they heard the triumphant yells of the advancing Confederates than the hapless Germans? The wounding of Jackson, says a most careful historian of the battle, himself a participator in the Union disaster, was a most fortunate circumstance for the Army of the Potomac. At 9 o'clock, the capture or destruction of a large part of the army seemed inevitable. There was, at the time, great uncertainty and a feeling akin to panic prevailing among the Union forces round Chancellorsville. And when we consider the position of the troops at this moment, and how many important battles have been won by trivial flank attacks, how Richepince, attacking through the forest, with a single brigade ruined the Austrians at Hohenlinden, we must admit that the Northern Army was in great peril when Jackson arrived within 1,000 yards of its vital point, the White House, with 20,000 men and 50 cannon. He must be a great leader indeed, who, when his flank is suddenly rolled up and his line of retreat threatened, preserves sufficient coolness to devise a general counterstroke. Jackson had proved himself equal to such a situation at Cedar Run, but it is seldom in these circumstances that Providence sides with the big battalions. The Federal losses in the 6 days' battles were heavy, over 12,000 at Chancellorsville and 4,700 at Fredericksburg, Salem Church and Banks Ford, a total of 17,287. The army lost 13 guns, and nearly 6,000 officers and men were reported either captured or missing. But a mere statement of the casualties by no means represents the comparative loss of the opposing forces. Victory does not consist in merely killing and maiming a few thousand men. This is the visible result. It is the invisible that tells. The Army of the Potomac, when it retreated across the Rappahannock, was far stronger in mere numbers than the Army of Northern Virginia, but in reality it was far weaker, for the moral of the survivors and of the general who led them was terribly affected. That of the Confederates, on the other hand, had been sensibly elevated, and it is moral, not numbers, which is the strength of armies. What, after all, was the loss of 12,200 soldiers to the Confederacy? In that first week of May, there were probably 20,000 conscripts in different camps of instruction, more than enough to recruit the depleted regiments to full strength. Nor did the slaughter of Chancellorsville diminish to any appreciable degree the vast hosts of the Union.